innovate and create things so that they can join a university and continue that creative mentality and create research. No, we don't do that enough. Some countries in Africa are doing it better than others, but it's still generally it's not enough. And of course, for all these years, it is known that Africa is dependent on others for importing medicines and vaccines. It doesn't mean that every country should have its own vaccines. That is wrong. Not every country in Europe is producing its own vaccine anyway. Canada doesn't produce its own vaccines. It's about realizing that this is a global problem, so that therefore it requires global solutions, and it's about sitting together and deciding on that, which didn't happen, and I doubt if it will happen now. And to be honest with you, I doubt if we have another disaster like COVID in the next, I don't know, 2, 3, 5 years, that rich countries will behave differently. So yes, Africa should invest in its own capacity, but so there's two things. You have to invest now. You invest money, you invest in creating the environment, you invest in attracting those rich countries can help by making things jointly. So like if you're funding a research, for example, for, I don't know, an American university, ask them to have people from Africa to join them. And therefore there is there's more building capacity in Africa, but there's also more use of African intelligence. We kind of tend to think of it like, Africa doesn't have this intellectual capacity. Of course we do. And allowing this joint work, it doesn't only benefit African universities or African researchers, it also benefits other researchers, and therefore, at the end, it benefits humanity. So that's one concrete thing that can be done. But in terms of addressing COVID for now, it doesn't have to be African factory in South Africa or Senegal or wherever that can produce mRNA or any other vaccine. There are other developing countries that can, or even countries in Europe that can. I mean, it doesn't really matter where they are. Right now, we're in emergency, and in emergency, use everything you have, and that's what's not happening. We know that there are companies in India that can produce these vaccines if somebody shares the technology and the know-how with them, and if somebody puts some money to for them to upgrade their pipeline or to create new pipelines to produce the vaccines. But that's just not happening. Last May, in the World Health Assembly, the Minister of Health from Indonesia, he said that that his country has companies that can produce 500 million doses of COVID vaccines every year. Well, he said they're sitting doing nothing for COVID so far. So in the short run, so we need to share the technology and the know-how, which in the short run, in the next 4-6 months, can produce vaccines for now, but also in the long run can help Africa to invest to develop its capacity for producing other vaccines, not just for COVID, but for other things. There is, for example, cases of Marburg fever now in Guinea.
Yeah.
It is under control, but it suddenly got, it's like Ebola, we don't have vaccines, we don't have medicines for Marburg. So basically all you have is infection control and public health measures, so like following contacts and all that, which are obviously important, no doubt. But we don't have anything to prevent or treat in terms of medical thing. Why don't we invest in research and attract researchers and people working on this kind of diseases so that we can develop something in the future that is at least have African contribution, if not totally African?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamal Yani. Patrick, let me come to you, because this conversation also will affect the future for vaccine and public health policy across the continent. Let's put COVID aside, because we're in the middle of this crisis and it's quite specialist. Where do you think the investment should be going? Because across the continent, there's still a lot of need for vaccine solutions to many easily transmittable diseases. And so where should the focus in terms terms of manufacturing capacity be in production of vaccine or treatment capacity across the continent? Because obviously the reliance on, say, India to provide the bulk of Africa's vaccine needs have not worked.
Yes, so I think one needs an expanded approach. And what I mean by that is that what we're really trying to solve here is the exclusive reliance that we have as a continent on supply of product from outside. Priority products like vaccines, especially in emergency situations. But as has been pointed out earlier, the reality is that not only in emergency situations do we fall back and have to rely on this dependency on external suppliers, but for routine vaccines, we actually do the same. Now, one part of the equation says that we need to focus on building capacity and enabling that capacity in terms of infrastructure and skills through technology transfers for an accelerated pathway to making product locally. So that's one focus area within the vaccine value chain.
Is this a conversation that's happening?
That is that is in the process of unfolding, and we can talk about the PAVM as well, in terms of that being, as someone put it, the engine room of the vaccine manufacturing capacity building efforts. But I want to make the point that it's not good enough only focusing on vaccine manufacturing capability, because if you only have that capability, then you're reliant on a technology transfer and a partner to deliver that in order for you to manufacture. What we need to do is simultaneously, in parallel, step up the value chain and also install the vaccine development capability, the research and development capability, so that after a period of time, we have in an increasing way, we can step up and break the cycle of total dependency on external supply over a period of time in a stepwise fashion. And so this then falls back onto the issue of where are the routine vaccines coming from, and that's where the capacity needs to be built, and that supply from the companies producing it needs to be commitment to buying that supply. And that's another important issue, because it's one thing establishing capacity, it's another thing sustaining that capacity over a period of time.
And our ability to buy even routine vaccines is reliant on WHO and other donor support, isn't it?
That complicates matters significantly, because as you have pointed out, around about, I think it's 40 countries are partially or exclusively dependent on supply from UNICEF supported by Gavi. And so in a way, we have a pool procurement mechanism already in place in Africa. It just resides in Copenhagen. So that is it's a challenge that we have to tackle with fresh eyes, and we have to reshape the way the market dynamics are currently at play within the continent, so that it incentivizes the investment in building capacity and sustaining capacity. Because if there is a market case to be made, then it would also attract partnerships and opportunities will follow.
I think, Patrick, you've sort of lifted the lid on an issue that will be controversial. Is the African continent too reliant on the UNICEFs and the Gavis, who, with very good intentions, have basically made us over-reliant and not looking at meeting our own needs? And any thoughts on that? Is that a conversation that should be happening now?
I think it is probably the conversation that we ought to be having, because talking about building vaccine manufacture without solving the sustainability factor, the sustainability equation, is a waste of time. We have to begin with the end in mind, and that end says that if we had capacity on the continent, how can we sustain it? And we all have been drawn to focus on the situation because of a blip and a devastating one that's called COVID-19, but it actually points to a structural problem, as Prof. Slim has pointed out, that there's a fundamental issue here that's not quite positioned correctly. Another thing that's important to appreciate is that not only did countries like the US throw $20 billion at Operation Warp Speed to get a product developed in record time, but they had an infrastructure to depend on, which produced routine vaccines every year. And that is what could be tapped into in terms of facilities, as well as the skills supporting and working in those facilities.
Just a reminder to everybody that you're listening to this BBC Africa Spaces conversation, and we're looking at Africa's vaccine future and what are the challenges and lessons of the COVID-19 vaccine distribution effort means for other public health vaccine efforts in the future. And I've got with me Dr. Moha Kamal Yani. She is the senior policy lead for the People's Vaccine Alliance. Professor Salim Abdul Karim, who's the director of the Center for the AIDS Program in South Africa and also a member of the African Task Force on Coronavirus. Patrick Tipu, we were just listening to, is the director of the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, and Anso, who's the deputy Africa director and a senior correspondent, and has been covering health issues across the continent for the BBC for a while. If you want to join in the conversation, please use the hashtag #AfricaVaccineFuture, and I'm really keen to read some of your comments and stories around this experience. So, Professor Salim, maybe I'll come to you. We're sort of looking ahead. So we won't have the kind of capacity in-house till next year. What should, before I come to that, who has been doing the best so far in terms of giving access to vaccines to its people? Which country?
They are at different stages of the pandemic. There have been countries that have done exceedingly well. If you take very early on, a country like Chile did very, very well in vaccinating its population because they were able to access vaccines from China because the Chinese companies were doing the studies in Chile. Similarly with Turkey, similarly with the United Arab Emirates. And studies with Chinese vaccines were undertaken in Morocco and in Egypt in Africa. And so those were the countries that had the highest vaccination coverage many months ago. However, once you look past what is widely referred to as vaccine diplomacy, where countries who are poor don't make their own vaccines, were able to secure vaccines from other countries that were making them. So they were able to vaccinate their populations earlier than others. But for the rest, and that applies to most of Africa, we've had to depend on COVAX and now on AVAT. So some countries, like South Africa, are able to purchase vaccines on their own. I think there are 7 countries in Africa that purchase their own vaccines. And those countries are now getting supply because rich countries have already secured what they need, so companies can free up quantities to make them available here.
And in terms of who is vaccinating, who's at the leader table at the moment?
So the countries that have achieved the highest vaccination coverage, some of them are very small countries, like the Seychelles. But if you take the bigger countries, among the highest vaccinated is Israel, the United Kingdom. Canada's doing pretty well right now, even though they had a slow start. Bahrain, So those are the countries that are, at the top end of the leaderboard.
And in
then would
Africa?
come in Africa, the most vaccinated populations are in Morocco, Egypt, and then Southern Africa is now catching up. That's South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, all catching up.
There are lots of requests from our listeners who want to know how different countries will come out of this at different stages, whether there needs to be a staggered vaccine rollout across the continent based on capacity and ability to roll out these vaccines. Because if we're going to wait for everybody to be vaccinated at the same time, we're in trouble, aren't we?
Absolutely. I think there's a real issue here because we're not only talking about availability of doses, and I think Anne covered this quite well, that we also have the challenge that the basic healthcare infrastructure needs to be able to distribute those vaccines and get the jabs into arms. And then, of course, comes the community side of, to what extent hesitancy plays a role. So all of those are going to be important. I take the view that the failure lies at a broader level. See, we cannot deal with this on a piecemeal basis. We've learned this from HIV. I've been doing research and part of the HIV response for 35 years now. We've learned in HIV that fundamentally we are interdependent. We are dependent on each other. And in COVID, no country will be safe for as long as other countries are not safe. No person is safe until everyone is safe. So if you want to take that as the underlying approach, then all countries should have a vested interest in making sure every other country is also vaccinating. And that applies to Africa. So it's in everyone's interest to ensure that every country is receiving vaccines and is vaccinating, because this is a pandemic. It affects the whole world. We've got to treat it like a disease that affects the whole world and solve it in the whole world. No country is going to be an island. It can vaccinate its population and believe that it's not going to have any more COVID. That simply doesn't work. So I think that's at a very fundamental level, acknowledging our interdependence, acting on our independence, creating global structures to ensure that the world is being vaccinated, not at a country level only.
So we've got only 2 minutes to wrap up this discussion, and I must admit that I am actually filled with a lot of despair at the fact that we're such a long way away from many people across the continent being vaccinated. So, and that despair comes with a sense of helplessness, to be honest with you. So if you had sort of one way in which you can sort of offer some hope or encouragement for what people can do in their own spaces. I'll come to you one after the other. Dr. Mora, one piece of advice, short please, so we can wrap it up. Dr. Kamalyani? Okay, looks like there we go.
Sorry. If it is like us as people, then get vaccinated when it's possible. Wear a mask. Be careful about not being in a crowd. Meantime, please help campaigning to break the monopoly on knowledge. And allow the vaccine technology to be a global public good so that it can be produced anywhere in the world that can produce it. And then people in Africa can actually have the vaccine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Patrick Tipo, 30 seconds from you.
And can I just say that my name is Moga?
Okay, Moga. Thank you. Patrick.
Final word. You're muted. I think he might be speaking, but he's muted.
Okay. Maybe Professor Salim, final word from you, 30 seconds.
Sure. Just, I think fundamentally, we've got to now step up to the plate. The doses are arriving. We've got to get them into arms. I mean, we're showing in South Africa, we're now vaccinating about 1 million people in 3 days. We've got to make sure we can do that across the continent as doses arrive now.
Thank you very much. Anne?
I'll just pick up from where Dr. Kamal Yani had mentioned about intellectual capacity. I think we have seen from Ebola to yellow fever that the intellectual capacity exists on the continent. The capacity is there. The game changer, I think, will be with the leadership. When the leadership needs to be very deliberate to invest in research. At the moment, the manufacture we're talking about on the continent is basically finish and fill. It is not from scratch. That will take time, as a professor has said. But with leadership, Africa, I believe, can get there. I am optimistic.
Do we have Patrick for final word?
Yes, I'm yes. Sorry about the thing earlier, but I agree too. I'm optimistic, and efforts are underway to pull together in a coordinated way to ensure that we are